That's no problem. There's no sense rushing this. All right, so we're going to go, before we do that, I want to finish my discussion of the idea of the psychological significance of the idea of God. And I've been thinking about this a lot more, because, of course, this lecture series gives me the opportunity and the necessity to continue to think. And, it certainly is the case. So the hypothesis that I've been developing with the Trinitarian idea is something like that the Trinitarian idea is the earliest emergence in image of the idea that there has to be an underlying cognitive structure that gives rise to consciousness as well as consciousness itself. And so what I was suggesting was that the idea of God the Father is something akin to the idea of the a priori structure that gives rise to consciousness. That's an inbuilt part of us, so that's our structure. You could think about that as something that's been produced over a vast evolutionary time span, and I don't think that's completely out of keeping with the ideas that are laid forth in Genesis 1, at least if you think about them from a metaphorical perspective. And it's hard to read them literally because I don't know what, there's an emphasis on day and night, but the idea of day and night as 24-hour diurnal, daytime and nighttime interchanges that are based on the earthly clock seems to be a bit absurd when you first start to think about the construction of the cosmos. So it just doesn't seem to me that a literal interpretation is appropriate. And I mean, it's another thing that you might not know, but many of the early church fathers, one of them, Origen in particular, stated very clearly, this was in 300 AD, that these ancient stories were to be taken as wise metaphors and not to be taken literally. Like the idea that the people who established Christianity, for example, were all the sorts of people who were biblical literalists is just absolutely historically wrong. I mean, some of them were, and some of them still are. That's not the point. Many of them weren't, and it's not like people who lived 2,000 years ago were stupid by any stretch of the imagination. And so they were perfectly capable of understanding what constituted something approximating a metaphor, and also knew that fiction, in some sense, considered as an abstraction, could tell you truths that nonfiction wasn't able to get at, unless you think that fiction is only for entertainment. And I think that's a big mistake to think that. So, all right, so here we go. So, yes, so with regards to the idea of God the Father, so the idea is that in order to make sense out of the world, you have to have an a priori cognitive structure. And that was something that Immanuel Kant, as I said last time, put forward as an argument against the idea that all of the information that we acquire during our lifetime is a consequence of incoming sense data. And the reason that Kant objected to that, and he was absolutely right about this, is that you can't make sense of sense data without an a priori structure. You can't extract from sense data the structure that enables you to make sense of sense data. It's not possible. And that's really been demonstrated, I would say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, since the 1960s. And the best demonstration of that was actually the initial failure of artificial intelligence. Because when the AI people started promising that we would have fully functional and autonomous robots and artificial intelligence back in the 1960s, what they didn't understand and what stalled them terribly until about the early 1990s was that it was almost that the problem of perception was a much deeper problem than anybody ever recognized. Because like when you look out at the world, you just see, well, look, there's objects out there. And by the way, you don't see objects. You see tools, just so you know. And the neurobiology of that's quite clear. You don't see objects and infer utility. You see useful things and infer object. So it's actually the reverse of what people generally think. But the point is that regardless of whether you see objects or useful things, when you look at the world, you just see it, and you think, well, seeing is easy because there the things are, and all you have to do is turn your head and they appear. And that's just so wrong that it's almost impossible to overstate. Like the problem of perception is staggeringly difficult, and one of the primary reasons that we still don't really have autonomous robots, although we're a lot closer to it than we were in the 1960s, is because it turned out that you actually have to have a body. You have to have a body before you can think. And even more importantly, you have to have a body before you can see, because the act of seeing is actually the act of mapping the patterns of the world onto the patterns of the body. It's not things are out there, you see them, then you think about them, then you evaluate them, then you decide to act on them, and then you act. I mean, that you could call that a folk idea of psychological processing or perception. It's not, that is not how it works. Like your eyes, for example, map, one of the things they do is map right onto your spinal cord, for example. They map right onto your emotional system. So it's actually possible, for example, for people to be blind and still be able to detect facial expressions. which is to say you can, for someone who's cortically blind, so they've had their visual cortex destroyed often by a stroke, they'll tell you that they can't see anything. But they can guess which hand you put up if you ask them to, and if you flash them pictures of angry or fearful faces, they show skin conductance responses to the more emotion-laden faces. And it's because, imagine that the world is made out of patterns, which it is, and then imagine that those patterns are transmitted to you electromagnetically, that through light, and then imagine that the pattern is duplicated on the retina, and then that pattern is propagated along the optic nerve, and then the pattern is distributed throughout your brain, and some of that pattern makes up what you call conscious vision, but other parts of it just activate your body. And so, for example, when I look at this, whatever it is, bottle, that's the word. You know, when I look at it, especially with intent in mind, as soon as I look at it, the pattern of the bottle activates the gripping mechanism of my hand, and part of the action of the act of perception is to adjust my bodily posture, including my hand grip, to be of the optimal size to pick that up. And it's not that I see the bottle and then think about how to move my hand. That's too slow. It's that I use my motor cortex to perceive the bottle, and that's actually somewhat independent of actually seeing the bottle as a conscious experience. So, anyways, the reason that I'm telling you that all of that, and there's much more about that can be told. Rodney Brooks, he's someone to know about. He's a robotics engineer who worked in the 1990s, and he invented the Roomba, among many other things. So he's a real genius, that guy. And Brooks was one of the first people to really point out that to be able to have a machine that perceived well enough to work in the world, that you had to give it a body, and that the perception would actually be built from the body up rather than from the abstract cognitive perceptions down. And so, well, and that turned out to be the case. And Brooks built all sorts of weird little machines in the 1990s that didn't even really have any central brain, but they could do things like run away from light. And so they could perceive light, but their perception was the act of running away from light. And so perception is very, very, very tightly tied to action in ways that people don't normally perceive. Anyways, that's all to say that you cannot perceive the world without being embodied. And, you know, you're embodied in a manner that's taken you roughly 3.5 billion years to pull off, right? There's been a lot of death as a prerequisite to the embodied form that you take. And so it's taken all that trial and error to produce something like you that can interact with the complexity of the world well enough to last the relatively paltry 80 or so years that you can last. And so I think about that as, and this may be wrong, but I think it's a useful, at least it's a useful hypothesis. I think the idea of God the Father is something like the birth of the idea that there has to be an internal structure that out of which consciousness itself arises that gives form to things. And, well, and if that's the case, and perhaps it's not, but if it's the case, it's certainly it's a reflection of the kind of factual truth that I've been describing now. And then, like I also mentioned, that I kind of see the idea of both the Holy Spirit and also of Christ, and most specifically of Christ in the form of the Word.